We're live.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
My name is Bobby Sprinkle. Bobby following Robbie. We did that on purpose. So that's good. A couple of people have said, well, Bobby will talk about that if he gets up his talk. If that means I'm not talking about anything they suggested. So hopefully it will still be useful. We are working on security policies. We are working on providing those resources. We're just not going to talk about it in this particular presentation, at least in detail. We also had a lot of discussion about prompt engineering, which I failed at miserably. So I went, the second I got this topic, AI, and I said, write me a presentation on privacy, security, legal, and ethical concerns in AI. And we're going to look at it and see what happens. So I actually like the title, A Brave New World, but at what cost, right? Anything in here that's got an image or looks like this is completely AI generated. It's not my content. You will very clearly be able to discern what is mine by the crappiness of the slides versus what this looks like. So just so you can see. But, you know, I'm not going to actually, but it actually didn't do a bad job. Personal data, you got to worry about. Behavioral data, talking about privacy. It was sort of interesting. All of this completely generated from AI. And we're talking about algorithmic vulnerabilities and attacks. How do we provide security for those various things? Again, you know, it's right on target for what you want to talk about. Needs a lot more detail. What is the legal landscape? This is interesting. In the software I was using, I asked it, give me more detail on this, and it just added, they were originally just like 2 sentences, and it immediately added more text there just to see what it did. We're going to talk about algorithmic transparency. So again, it's not doing too bad. Legal frameworks in US. We run into our first problem, which is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act really has nothing to do with what we're talking about. And in Europe, the proposed AI Act is no longer proposed, it's actually been passed into law. So AI is not perfect at getting all of this stuff together. My question, of course, where's the ethical boundary, right? Of I didn't do anything. You're talking about the ethics of, is this my work? No. Does it still have some value? Sure. How does it get presented? I don't know. But I'm more interested in the security of it. So gamma.ai is what I used. It's a screenshot. You can just go on there and say, write me a slide deck, and it'll build you a slide deck on almost any topic. It's really pretty slick, but let's look at the terms and conditions. So it collects data. It collects a whole series of data. A lot of it is pretty normal for a website, but user-generated content. So any photos, images, videos, presentations, or any material that you load up there to help it make up its slide deck is user-generated content, and they collect it. So what can they do with it? They do pretty much anything they want with it. So this was bigger on my screen. I need my leadership. So we may use your personal information, developmental purposes, to analyze. They can use it for research. They can use it to develop new products and services. So they own that data, and they can do pretty much whatever they want with it. So who can they share it with? Pretty much anybody they want to. So their business partners, if they're going to be sold, they can, a hedge fund wants to buy them, anybody else, they can share it with them. They can share it with affiliates. What does affiliate mean? Anybody. These are incredibly broad terms on the security terms and conditions. Can you opt out? No. So if you want to use this, you have to accept those terms and conditions. There are no opt-outs. They actually act like there's opt-outs, but if you read the fine print there, the opt-out is you can't really use the system, right? So sure, you can opt out. You can't opt out for marketing emails. That's a book. They can transfer it internationally. Anybody they want to in any country they want to. So there is no restriction on who they give it to or what. You might think because, if I go back, There's a little phrase in there about if you're in Europe, look here. You're like, oh, Europe's got GDPR. They're going to be extra protected, right? Wrong. So user-generated content has been classified as a service delivery and operations part of their job, and therefore GDPR provides no protection. They clearly lay it out there. So even in Europe, you don't get any protection on this. You might think that this is just Gamma.ai, but here's OpenAI's terms and conditions. The same thing. I'm not going to go into this much detail, but we may use the content to provide, maintain, develop, or improve services, comply with applicable law, etc. You can drive a Mack truck through those. So today we use Christopher. While we were sitting there, I pulled up the terms and conditions of DID. Let me see if I can get them because I had to take a picture. There it says, anything? Gordon loaded up there. He is hereby granted a worldwide exclusive, royalty-free, perpetual, transferable right to use, reproduce any animations, outputs, blah, 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 derivative works, display of, including without limitation, redistributing parts or all of it, and any derivative works there are, all moral rights. They waive any moral rights, and they can pretty much give it to anybody they want to. So this is very, very common that the security protections of AI tools are zero. They're negative. They're so bad, right? Our students have no idea that this is true. Most faculty have no idea this is true. So you might think to yourself, oh, I'm going to a conference. I got to give a presentation. Let me load up all my research data in here to Gamma.ai and get this really great presentation built out. I'll edit it, change it, it'll still be all my work, but I can really do it. Now Gamma.ai owns all of that data. The IP implications are pretty bad. So then you have to say, what are some of these legal issues? Because security starts to bleed into what's a copyright? Who owns intellectual property? Patent and trademark infringement law, do they even apply? When generative AI creates something, who owns it? Is it just because you prompted it that you own the output? Who knows? There's no legal remedy. We have no idea who owns the generative AI output. When is something not derivative enough? Most patent, trademark, and infringement law, copyright, has a derivative use exception. You can make satire, you can do things with it. How derivative is derivative? We talked about earlier that there is no original content, right? That everything's built on it. Generative AI, that's 100% true. They're scraping 1,000 different things to build together some image, some text, some something. So what does derivative even mean in this case? Also, there's a lot of fair use doctrine employed. What is fair use when you're talking about AI? Lawsuits abound. There are too many to count. I'm not exaggerating. I tried to count. There are hundreds. OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, Anthropic, Meta, you name it, they are being sued. It took me, I very quickly gave up on counting, and I started classifying. What types of lawsuits are we talking about? So we're talking about text and literary works, visual arts, music, and audio. Most of that is copyright stuff. It's people that are suing, saying you use my novel to train your model. That's not allowed, right? So there's a ton of that stuff all over the place. There's direct infringement that they've literally just taken, stuff in these training models and use them for however they want. I don't even know what secondary liability is because I'm not a lawyer, but that's a classification. Unfair competition. Now we've got starting saying these companies are suing each other on what is the ability to build a model, who has rights to what kinds of models, what kind of math you can use in the models. You have people claiming privacy and personal rights issues. So you have people suing all of these companies saying that you took my personal data and you're using it somehow in your models or something along that. Business model changes, technical adaptions, legal compliance, it goes on and on. There are hundreds of lawsuits. So we are in a legal Wild West, right? It is really uncertain as to how this is all going to pan out. But there are some changes. Now, this is the first time I could find a judge that made a definitive ruling. Now, it's only a partial ruling, and it's pretty recent. But on February 11th, the federal judge in Delaware issued a partial summary judgment for Thomson Reuters against the startup company who's no longer in business. But it was a copyright infringement lawsuit against this AI startup. Importantly, the case was filed in 2020, so we're 5 years in before the judgment came. So all these other lawsuits have years to percolate through as this all works its way out. What's interesting is they rejected the fair use defense. So the AI company can't say, hey, we were just using it for, general education or research purposes, fair use kind of stuff that's generally allowed. The judge says, that's not true. That's not what you were doing. Importantly, this was not a generative AI case. So generative AI still has some work to do on some of these legal issues, but it is the first time I've seen a judge actually issue a ruling. Now, I'm not a legal expert, there may be others out there, but it's the first one I could find. So the courts have recognized they're in pretty uncharted territory here. So this is not your normal everyday copyright. This isn't normally how business is done. This is a whole new world we're in, but there are some trends emerging. Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, most judges are tossing anybody that is defending based on that. So the DMCA, if you don't know, pretty much is what, I think it came out in '98, and it is what protects Google, Facebook, YouTube from people putting copyrighted material on their websites. So they have to have a notify and take down structure, but if they do have that, they're protected from liability. So if I illegally download a movie and I load it up to YouTube, 1,000 people can watch it, YouTube isn't in trouble, as long as when Sony contacts them and says, hey, this movie's up there, take it down, they take it down. So that's what the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is. A lot of these AI companies are saying, that's it. Whatever, the training model is doing its own thing, right, or whatever. It's not us that's doing it. They said, see it, that can't happen. Most copyright claims, they're letting go forward. So no judge that I could find has turned down the copyright claim. So if an author or somebody who wrote a movie or made a painting, they're allowing those lawsuits to go forward saying that the AI companies were using this without proper licensure. There's a lot of focus on fair use analysis. So just to give you kind of a lay of the land on what we're looking at legally, again, it's a wild west. None of this has been fully decided. A few trends sort of taking shape. So let's look at the American legal framework. There's dueling executive orders. Make one, cancel one. It's great. So really, there is nothing at the federal level that applies in a strong sense. There is some interesting state level stuff starting to happen. Utah was the first to pass a law. It went into effect May 1st, 2024. It's pretty basic, but it simply says you can't use AI to deceive people. It's pretty broad, right? There's a lot of loopholes in there, but that's what they're starting to try to say. California just passed 2 laws, going into effect at different times. One went into effect January 1st, and it's focused on image, video, and audio, probably because Hollywood's in California. There's a lot of content creation going on there. However, it is saying you have to allow a watermark if you're going to generate it. So if I go to ChatGPT and I generate an image, I have to be allowed to put a watermark on it that says this was created by ChatGPT. But they also say you have to add a latent disclosure. It's an interesting term, which just means it's an invisible metadata tag so that you can track it with an AI detector. I was a little confused when I first started reading about AI detectors because I thought what they were saying is we're going to read text and figure out if somebody had AI generate that. That's not quite what they're doing by just the text. What they want to do is force the AI companies to put a hidden tag in any generated thing so that it can then be tracked later on. And if somebody says, oh, here's an image that somebody might be saying I made or I did, but an AI detector can see that invisible tag and go, no, this was AI generated. So they passed a law that says has to happen. It's a state law, right? So it doesn't affect anybody that's not in the state. We'll have to see how that shakes out. But it is really focused on protecting the image, video, and audio. Then you get into Assembly Bill 2013. That doesn't go into effect until next year. And this is where you get into transparency. They want to know if you're using generative AI, you have to be able to publicly disclose what's in the model. What data did you use? So that's going to be pretty hard, I think, but that's what the law says. So you got to be able to publicly disclose whatever data used in creating the model. There's a whole series of, I'm not going to list them all out, rules on what they have to disclose and how and what counts as being in the model versus not. It's like an 80-page bill, so have fun reading that. Colorado passed one that says it doesn't go into effect until January 1st, 2026 either. They want to protect against algorithmic discrimination. So this is an interesting one. They're saying they want to categorize AI into high-risk systems. In a second, we're going to start talking about the EU AI Act, which does something similar. A high-risk system, according to Colorado, I love this definition, is any machine that uses data to make a consequential decision. So I was like, holy cow, I'm not sure. Again, you could drive a Mack truck to that thing, right? So what they're trying to say is they want to protect against AI making decisions for people like, do I get health care or not? Do I get into university or not? Do I get car insurance or not, right? So these are what they're trying to say, and that's really what EU focused on. So the EU AI Act went into effect, was passed in August, went into effect this month. Although there are provisions that don't go into effect for 3 years, it sort of staggers its provisions. What's interesting to me is this doesn't cover anything, or very little, about image, audio, like California was worried about. This is worried about decision making. So it's saying, I don't want a law enforcement to arrest someone just because AI said this person is a criminal. It actually has specific laws that say you cannot do prediction of criminal conduct based on profiling. That's like Minority Report. We think you're about to commit a crime, right? So they ban that. They ban anything in health insurance, consumer lending. If you get a house loan or not, can't use it to determine that. No AI is allowed. So it's strictly banned. So they're really focused on bias and discriminatory bias and how that's being used. They're not focused as much on protection. They do have a lot of transparency rules. Like if someone is interacting with an AI, they must be told. So if I call a help desk and I'm just interacting with an AI client in Europe, it has to say, this is an AI person that you're talking to, not a human. So we interesting to see how these laws shape out. This law went into effect literally days ago. So you don't have any idea what challenges there's going to be to the law, what other kinds of repercussions are going to come from it. If America is going to follow suit in any way, shape, or form, you can see Colorado already is doing a little bit in that space. So what do we do? I'm not sure. So what are the legal implications? The onus seems to be on the AI companies. They're not saying, which they did with the internet, the onus is on the user. Because in the internet, with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and other things like that, they allowed people to say, you have to opt out. So Google's allowed to collect all of your information unless you specifically say, I don't want to. They're taking the opposite tack here, which is saying you can't do anything unless you're specifically told you can. You need to obtain explicit permission for training data. These are things that could come. I'm not saying they all exist completely. I'm saying get ready for these kinds of discussions. It's already happening a little bit. OpenAI just licensed all of Guardian Media's content, so they can use it. Guardian Media is an English conglomerate of media, newspapers, TV, that sort of thing. OpenAI just licensed all of it. So they're starting to pay. You may have to start implementing compensation systems for creators. You might have to tag AI-generated content. You may need to develop whole new approaches to how you do training. You can't just say, go scrape the whole internet, at least not in Europe. You have to step aside in Asia, scrape the internet, and then step back. I'm not sure how that's going to work, right? So you may have to modify your business model. You know, OpenAI right now is charging money at a certain rate, which, by the way, we find exorbitant. We can't offer it at an enterprise level of this university because it's so expensive. And now you're talking about they may have to charge more because they got to start licensing all this stuff. So these are really hard questions that are going to be answered. But what do? Developers, you need to understand what your data sources are. Maintain provenance, audit trails. You need to be able to track this stuff down. You need to be prepared to follow something like the EU AI Act or something like it. I doubt we're going to get the full act. When the GDPR came out, we did not follow suit here. We're a very different kind of view of that in this country. So I don't think it's going to be as restrictive as the EU AI Act, but I think it's going to have some restrictions. I do believe you're going to see people saying you can't deny someone health insurance because of an AI machine. Creators, understand the risk of your IP. Don't stick it into gamma.ai. For God's sakes, whatever you do, right? You can use some of these companies, and we'll talk about that in a second, if you have enterprise agreements. Vanessa talked about that as one of the things she'd like to see more of. Don't load content API that doesn't have that contractual protection. We have a contractual agreement with Microsoft. I'll show you that in a second. Businesses, you need to write IP protections into contracts. You need to secure licenses if you're doing training. You need to have a lot of indemnification for IP infringement. It's all lawyering talk. And this is going to be important stuff because somebody's going to be able to say, hey, you used this painting I made in some classroom somewhere and now you got to pay. You need to consider building custom private LLMs, right? So we're really going to have to start looking at how do we localize and collapse the data we're looking at in our LLMs. It probably is not going to be allowed without paying a fairly heavy fee, scraping the whole internet, right? I don't know what that's going to look like legally. Just to show you, can you see it up there? So up in the upper right, you see that green check mark. You can see I'm logged in down here. And this is the enterprise version of Copilot that we have. This has got contractual protections. So anything we load into Copilot is not gone into the language model. It doesn't go anywhere but here. It goes into the cloud, but it doesn't leave our private part of that cloud. So this is a contractually protected suite of tools. You can use Copilot here. You can load your paper up in there. You can have it create images for you as long as you're logged in with your FSU ID. And you've got that green check mark up there in Copilot. And let nothing else has that level of protection with FSU. So if you have the paid version of OpenAI, you're paying $30 a month. Your terms and conditions still say they own all your data. Just because you're paying doesn't mean you get away from that. Only if they have contractually agreed not to use your data with the company are you getting that level of protection. Some cases that's okay, right? For me, I went to gamma.ai and I just said, I didn't put anything up there. I just said, give me something. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't use these things. I'm saying be cognizant of what you're doing and what you're putting up there. And I think we need a whole lot of education in this space because it doesn't exist right now. I'm going to do it in time. Privacy. I'm not going to talk a lot actually about privacy, but one thing was interesting. I read this in the Harvard Business Review. Established notions of privacy are based on the idea that humans are the primary handlers of information. It is not designed to contain the computational ability of AI. So when you think of privacy, we typically think, I don't want somebody else, person, seeing what I'm doing, my health records, whatever, right? So there's a, even when you say I want the government to know, you're still talking about people in the government. We're talking about human beings. Our idea of privacy is based on a person having a view of something that I want to keep private, hidden, whatever the case is. When we're talking about AI, you're scraping large sets of data. It's not a person, right? And the computational ability it has to see 100 million records all at once goes beyond anything we've ever had before. The key thing you need to remember when we're talking about privacy is consent. You must receive consent. So AI, it is way too easy to just say, yeah, sweep it all up, give me the analysis. And sometimes we want it for the research, right? But we can't. Must be informed and must be confirmed. They're going to hold you to this. When you start looking at the legal frameworks that are starting to take shape, one of the big themes is that the companies are responsible for what's going on. And they're going to hold the researcher responsible if they suddenly use the training set on a hospital and it scooped up a bunch of people's data that maybe it shouldn't have. Another slide. Again, there's a little bit. So now we're talking about bias. I want to talk about this a little bit because that's what Colorado's law was focused on. That is what the EU is really focused on, which is discriminatory bias. And I want to talk about some of the issues that we have with that. When you think about ethical considerations, bias and fairness, misinformation, job displacement, we got a whole kinds of things we've been talking about this whole day. Really kind of boils down to do no harm, right? If you're going to be, you don't want to have one person or group be privileged over another person or group. You would prefer not to have too much job displacement. How do you mitigate that and make it less, right? Try to do as little harm as possible. But the number one thing that pops up on every AI list when you ask about ethical considerations is algorithmic transparency and explainability. So people do not like black boxes. So we must understand the why of a decision. It builds trust, accountability, it helps to combat bias. Negative outcomes have to be allowed to be challenged. If I am told you don't get health insurance, I want to know why. And it cannot be the machine told us. We have no idea why, right? So if I'm getting arrested because I popped up somewhere, I better be able to know why. It cannot be because the machine said so. So this is getting really hard to do. These are complex algorithms. They've got an enormous amount of non-linearity. They have dynamic learning. They're literally learning on the fly. So what you might say, this is how this machine made a decision day one, would be different on day two. So this is getting hard to do. Data privacy concerns. If you want to understand the why, you have to dig into all of this personal data. You're suddenly opening up all, the machine can look at it, and maybe you're not worried because the machine isn't going to share it with anybody, although it does create security concerns. But it's not going to go whisper it to its neighbor, right? But if you want to go explain why, now you're digging into the data. Technical expertise. The number of people that can dig into this is very small. There's not a lot of people that have the expertise that understand how these machine learning AI algorithms work. So what are you going to do? Say, stop your research. You got to come over here and explain to us why we're doing all this stuff. So it's going to be pretty difficult. So we need to start thinking about this in advance. We need to start thinking about model agnostic explanatory techniques. We need to talk about feature importance analysis. Right? Why was one decision made? This was weighed more than this part of the things, the factors that went into it. And we really need to start thinking about human-centered design. How are we, when we start to build these AI engines that are going to help us make a lot of these important decisions, how do we say, put the human at the center of that? The good news is, we've been here before. I just saw a presentation, Dr. Joel Davis, he's from the University of Florida, so it's a little suspect, but still. He gave a talk on technology's intersection with human cognition, and he brought up these examples. They've all been mentioned before. The printing press, Industrial Revolution was one of my favorites, right? The internet. If you lived in the Industrial Revolution, it probably stunk, right? You suddenly were urbanized, your kids were forced to go into the factory at 8 years old, you were in a tenement, it was awful, right? But when we came through the Industrial Revolution, we're all pretty glad it happened, right? We figured it out, it's better now, may not be perfect, but we don't have kids working 16-hour days when they're 8, right? So, at least in this country. So we figured it out. We're gonna do that with this as well, but it may not be fun for a little while, as Katie said. I think Gordon said that. It's not going to be fun in the short term. Zach Cass recently spoke, Power Forward Speaker Series, partially sponsored by the Division of Research. It was an excellent talk. He spoke about something that really struck me, which is societal thresholds versus technological thresholds. Just because the technology exists to do something doesn't mean society should do it. So we need to make strong decisions like the EU is, and say, we're not using AI here, I don't care how good it is, right? Because we've made the decision that it doesn't do this, that we're gonna do this, whatever that is. How you make a decision on, I don't know, who gets government assistance. I mean, it's just anything you can think of. You can throw these machines at it, and people are gonna wanna know, how are we making these decisions? So we're going to make some of these choices to say, as a society, we go this far and we stop. Now that can change over time. I'm not saying you have to, tomorrow we decided we're not going to go past this and then that never happens again, but we need to make those decisions and be thinking about it. This is my ending. I thought I'd end on an AI created slide. What we want to do is we want to keep innovation going, but we want to be very careful that we're balancing that with ethical considerations. And some of these are writ large in society. That's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Hey, I have a question. One of the almost the last slides about that we have been here before. I do understand the internet, but I also have been personally thinking about the social media. There is also basically, well, I think we have more negative impact, where we can see the negative impact on people in the social media. So based on that, what do you think, what kind of legal framework we can shape in the future?
Well, I do think the AI intersects with this a little bit. If you look at the EU AI Act, part of it is that you cannot use algorithms to influence behavior or to, I don't remember the exact terminology, manipulate people, right? Which a lot of people would say social media algorithms are doing on a daily basis, right? So I do think there are people recognizing that that's happening. You see people states in general starting to say, you can't use social media until you're 16, right? In the state of Florida, I think they're trying to pull that off. So I do think there's going to be some legal frameworks that come into play here. I don't know what they're going to look like because the courts are just really all over the place. And America is very different than Europe. We're a much more, let's freewheel it, figure it out on the fly than they are. And that's in good and bad, right? So I think it's going to take us a little bit longer to get there probably than they will, but we'll steady on some equilibrium at some point.